Okay, let's need to turn up. These are the mics on. There we go. All right, so let's get going here. Happy Friday. I think, are we officially like halfway through the semester? I think this is like the halfway mark exactly. All right, so I'm still working on the midterm. A few of the grades keep getting posted because Canvas is a weird system, and I've been using their iPad app to do the marking. But then once I update the grade, I think sometimes it posts it. So some of you probably have seen marks, some haven't. And some people were getting marks that were 0 out of 0 because I'd forgotten to set something properly. I think I've fixed that now. One day I'm going to learn how this system works. And for the moment, if something looks weird, just shoot me an email or come talk to me and I will then be aware of it because I don't know how this looks on your side. So we're going to figure this out. I think I'm about somewhere between half and 2/3 of the way through. I'm hoping to finish it this weekend. I'm visiting my in-laws, so I'm going to be like, oh, sorry, have to work. So my kids and my wife are coming. They'll amuse my in-laws, and I can sit with my iPad and mark your exams. It's every little boy's dream. So hopefully I'll be done by the end of the weekend and meet my like week and a half-ish kind of mark that I told you. Yeah, it takes a while. It's a slow process, and unfortunately the way Canvas is organized is a little bit worse for marking than eClass was. So in some ways, way better, in some ways, way worse. But anyway, I'm hoping to have it done by Sunday night, hopefully, and we'll see how that goes. It almost never goes as well as I want it to, but I will try. All right, I will take the criticism from my wife being like, "It seems like you weren't even here this weekend," and I'll go with that. That's not her voice. I don't know why I did that voice. Okay. So last time we were talking about our second secularization theory, right? So we have our first one, number one, is inherited model or classical model of secularization. Our second model of secularization is late secularization from Steve Bruce, right? And this model sort of, again, to kind of recapitulate it very quickly, secularization is going to happen the way the inherited model predict. It just started much later than we thought. But once it starts, it follows a very clear trajectory, each generation becoming about half as religious as the last. Okay, and he says, we aren't probably going to see a resurgence in religion for a couple of reasons. The first one, declining stocks of knowledge. There's less kind of general knowledge about religion, and here in the UK, he's thinking specifically about Christianity, right? People just don't know it, and so when they find themselves in times of trouble, they're not going to turn back to religion because they just don't know anything about it, and there's no basis from which you could launch a kind of revival because they don't know the basic doctrines of Christianity. Number two, right, social influence in religious conversion. We tend to convert to religions based on our relationships with other people, but increasingly, right, that marginal religious group is fading, and people just don't know as many religious people, so that is going to be relatively less powerful. And once you reach adulthood, your likelihood of picking up a religion shrinks considerably. So, with the generations getting less religious, there's going to be less kind of social relationships to draw people into religiosity. Okay. And religion, he says, is now alien, right? Like my picture at the beginning. Basically, those people who remain religious in the UK tend to be old. They tend to be living in rural settings, whereas the bulk of the population is in cities. They tend to be, let's just lump it all into foreign from an English perspective, right? They're Polish, they're African, or they're Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, right? They're from other parts of the world, often living in kind of segregated housing, segregated areas, and therefore less likely to form relationships. So you're less likely to convert to any of these religions because you're not going to form strong relationships with these folks. All right, and then religion has got a bit of a bad reputation. You could throw in, I think when Bruce is writing, this is a little bit less true now, it seems to have lost a little bit of its rhetorical power, but things like the sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, 9/11, and some other prominent things that were bad and related to religion, and what Bruce suggests, in largely secular society, trouble created by people claiming religious justification is blamed not on a specific religion, but just on religion in general. And again, you can think here of something like Christopher Hitchens's book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, as an example of this kind of point, right? And the rhetoric that sort of came around it. All right, and the last point, the thing from Bruce that we didn't talk about last time because we were one slide short of finishing Bruce, is othering, right? So, student tears taste so good. No, I'm kidding. It's coffee. Basically, what he suggests is that the general public mostly just has caricatures of religion on which to draw, right? They have an impression of religious people given by things like popular culture, right? So, their impression is not going to be very deep. It's not going to be very accurate to the actual beliefs of religious people. And so, this caricature that came from, say, folks like Hitchens, like Richard Dawkins, like Sam Harris, like Daniel Dennett, and all of these kind of pop culture atheists, that, religious people are sub-rational, right? They're dumb. And only an idiot could believe in these kinds of things. And I mean, Richard Dawkins recently, I think he was talking with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and he made very much this kind of, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's recently converted to Christianity, and Ali, he's basically making the case like, oh, come on, you can't actually believe any of this stuff, right? It's all kind of sub-rational and obvious nonsense. I think he actually used the phrase obvious nonsense to describe, Christianity. So, right, it's portrayed as sub-rational, often discriminatory, right? And this is, usually around things like LGBTQ, kind of questions, same-sex marriage, LGBTQ people and their relationships. And yeah, in some way inferior to kind of the broad kind of secular values that are everywhere. Okay, so like I said, you don't have to go very far to find these attitudes, right? r/atheist on Reddit, which you both should and shouldn't look at. For interest, you should look at it. Also, run away because it's a hive of scum and villainy, like all Reddit pages. Okay, so yeah, you find those attitudes. And what Bruce will say is that increasingly, as religion and religious people become less prominent in the public sphere, people who are religious come to seem kind of strange, right? Their behaviors seem kind of odd. Their beliefs seem, incomprehensible to a lot of people who have no context for them. And so, he'll say that they become kind of othered, right? They become this kind of mysterious other. They are, those people over there, evangelicals or, conservative Christians, right? But they're a kind of other. They're othered in some way, like they're apart from the mainstream. So he'll suggest that this makes it really, really difficult for religion to revive, because if it's just not something for which people have any frame of reference, or especially a good frame of reference, it's going to be difficult for religious people to convince non-religious people to join these religions. Okay. And my favorite bearded, snarky philosopher / theologian, David Bentley Hart, kind of broadly agrees with this position. Essentially what he suggests is, without really understanding what Christianity teaches, the West in particular now defines itself in opposition to Christianity as kind of post-Christian. And he suggests that it would be almost impossible for a culture that defines itself specifically as the kind of opposite of a Christian culture, a post-Christian culture, to fundamentally, have a religious revival or be re-evangelized by Christianity. Okay, so how are we doing with all that? Okay, So let's talk about sort of the polar opposite of these positions, right? Of both the inherited and the late secularization kind of theories. This one, so it comes from a piece by Stark called Secularization, Rest in Peace or RIP. And there's no, this piece comes out in 1999. I'll tell you a little bit about it in a sec. Stark has broadly been making this case since about the 1970s. And though there's no kind of official title for this position in the way that the inherited model has, a title, late secularization has a title, neo-secularization has a title, I sort of dub this either zero secularization or no secularization. There we go. And so you can refer to it as either of those, and I will understand what you are talking about. Okay, so, sorry, not in 2000. So in the year 2000, Stark publishes this article, RIP Secularization in Sociology of Religion, right? So Sociology of Religion is the leading journal in the field of sociology of religion. Not surprising, given its title, right? And basically what he says in this piece is that, look, we've come to 2000, we've sort of crossed this weird boundary, and it's time now to just admit once and for all that the secularization thesis, right, the theory that comes to us, from the deep dark past, was wrong, right? That secularization, as it was predicted in the inherited model, is done. Now, this is kind of for Stark, I would say, a culmination of a long-running battle that he's been having with other leading lights in the field, really since the beginning of his career. And he sees this as the final kind of triumph of this position of no secularization is actually happening. And he starts the piece basically with what's here. This is Peter Berger's kind of admission, right? That I think what I and most other sociologists of religion wrote in the 1960s about secularization was a mistake. Our underlying argument was that secularization and modernity go hand in hand. With more modernization comes more secularization. And Berger basically admits that this was wrong, right? And very, like I've mentioned his sort of prediction that by the year 2000, right, the last few religious people would be living in like isolated settlements, trying to escape a global, secular, modern kind of onslaught. And Berger, renounces this position in 1997, and Stark writes this piece in 2000, right, coinciding with that prediction of Berger's that by 2000 there'd be no religious people left, and he's basically thumbing his nose at all of his opponents, right? The piece is broadly, I would call it a victory lap for Stark. Just like, haha, look at your stupid prediction. It was stupid, and I told you it was stupid. Now, let's do a quick whirlwind tour of the world to show you just how stupid your prediction actually was. To say that it was not warmly received in some quarters would be an understatement. Okay, so Stark traces the roots of the secularization thesis, right, this idea, back to the end of the 17th century, right? So somewhere in like between 1680 and kind of 1690. So figures like Thomas Woolston, predicted Christianity would be gone as a result of modernization by 1900. Obviously, that didn't happen. Thomas Jefferson, right, in 1822, predicts that in his lifetime, Christianity would fade away. He thought it would be replaced by a sort of universalist Unitarianism. And very famously, right, Jefferson, who was a bit of a rationalist at the best of times, went through the Bible with a penknife and cut out all of the miracles, right, and left only the non-miraculous things in the Bible. Presumably that meant the Bible was much shorter. and saying like this is all we should keep of the Bible, right? It would be this part where we've cut out all of the miraculous and supernatural stuff because it doesn't make sense, right? Berger's prediction, which I've talked about like a million times, right? And basically on and on, right? And Stark says you could list these predictions ad nauseum because we've been making them, since the end of the 1600s. I will finish my thought and then I'll get to your question. And yet, religion persists even in the vaunted West. Yeah, John, what could I? Oh, no, but he was saying by the beginning of the 21st century, like by the year 2000, right? That religion should be gone. But yeah, it seems unlikely that it's going anywhere. Please. Oh, so Unitarianism basically is a belief that God is a united being. So it's sort of an argument against the Christian notion of a Trinity. And Jefferson specifically sort of believes that he's what's called a deist. He believes that there was a supernatural being who we call God, who sort of created the universe, got the clock started and then walked away and is like no longer on the scene. Maybe went to play video games, maybe, is making another universe out there somewhere. We don't really know, but is now just sort of not involved in the world. So aside from the origins of life, there isn't really any need for God because everything else is sort of natural processes, right? Yeah. Okay. So, 5 things that Stark says are kind of core beliefs of the secularization faithful. He calls them the secularization faithful, those who have put their faith in this kind of theory of secularization. Okay, so number 1, and we've talked about this already, that amongst those who believe in secularization, right, and this would be true from, from Wollstonecraft to Weber to Marx to Berger before his renunciation, that basically there's a universal agreement. Why don't we get the highlighter out? We'll do some highlighting. That modernization is the causal engine dragging the gods into retirement. So, modernization, toxic to religion. Okay, now, this second point, not all of these are in order, and sometimes it's hard to explain, but point number 2 has to do more with the next theory we're going to learn after this, which is called neo-secularization, which, in which people like Mark Chavez are going to make the case that, okay, fine. Religion's not going anywhere. Religion's still going to be around. People are still going to believe in something. But what we really meant this whole time by secularization was institutional differentiation, right? That basically the religious authority is going to decrease as the state takes over more functions of religion. Okay, now, Stark says, okay, this is poppycock. This is not what anybody who has historically believed in the inherited model or its offshoots has believed, right? That basically, we're just talking about institutional differentiation, right? That actually, they are principally concerned with individual piety, right? Or individual belief. And that this thing we're like, it's just society's changing. I believe Stark's description of this, and I don't remember if it's in this piece or in The Triumph of Faith, which is his longer kind of recapitulation of this. He's like, okay, poppycock, right? And he accuses his opponents basically of just sort of shifting definitions to, dodge the fact that secularization as like a total decline in religious belief has not happened and doesn't show any signs of its complete victory anytime soon, right? So what he says is that folks like Chavez, who again we'll meet a little bit later, who make this kind of, this claim that's essentially, we were right about secularization as religion playing less of a role in society, but wrong about people no longer believing in anything. That what they're doing is they're sort of renovating a broken theory to try and save aspects of it. But really, this is what they were, and maybe I'll highlight this in a bold and angry color. We'll go with orange. That from the beginning, folks like Weber, Marx, and all those cats were really concerned with individual piety, right? Marx very much like, once we get la révolution, right, communism, right, as we march towards the victory of communism, individual piety would disappear. Sorry, that's a line from the Soviet national anthem, which for some reason I know off the top of my head. What's that? Nothing. I could probably sing it for you, but I don't know that that would be a particularly pleasant experience for any of us. Okay, so number two, he's like, basically, I know I'm being a little convoluted, but he's basically saying that the people who have recently shifted their definition to say, oh, well, what we really meant was, institutional differentiation. He's like, that's bullshit, right? You know, you all meant this, and you're just shifting the goalposts to try and A, save face, and B, save your precious theory. That's dumb. He might not have said it quite like that, but that's kind of what's implied. Okay. Number three. He says that all people who believe in secularization agree that science has deadly implications for religion, right? And this, again, you're going back to Berger, you're going back to Weber, that scientific, and Durkheim, right? Scientific rationalism is going to destroy those plausibility structures of religion, right? That there's no way religion survives the explosion of science. Yeah, please. He is not. At this point in his life. Stark is a weird dude. I love him so much. I have a shrine to him in my house and a stained glass window where I worship every day. No, I'm kidding. I wish I could get a stained glass window of Rodney Stark, but it would be too expensive. Both he and Bainbridge, kind of at this point in their careers, suggest that, well, they kind of respect religion in a lot of ways. Neither of them has ever been able to actually embrace religious belief, right? They're like, religion's cool, don't believe a word of it, but it's still kind of cool. Towards the end of his life, Stark comes to this position where he says that he calls himself an independent Christian. And when he's asked what that means, he says that's deeply personal and then just doesn't answer the question, which has always left me with what did that actually mean? I'm like, I'm okay with it, but I'm just like, I don't know what you mean by that. And I mean, some of his later books are very triumphalist in terms of his view of Christianity and its cultural value. But yes, at this point, and for most of his life, he's not someone who considers himself religious. So, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. And again, he's very guarded about it. So we probably will never really know what he meant. We could get the Ouija board out and see if we can summon his spirit and go from there. But, bad things can happen with Ouija boards too. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. The fourth one is he'll say that those who believe in secularization think that secularization cannot be reversed, right? So once a society becomes secular, it's never going to become religious again, right? I've heard the metaphor be put that secularization is kind of like squeezing the toothpaste out of the tube, right? Efforts to get the toothpaste back in the tube are not going to be very successful. That once, you've squeezed it out, you're not putting it back in any kind of way that makes sense, right? It's going to be an ugly process and probably kind of impossible. So secularization, again, Stark disagrees with this, but the people who believe in the secularization thesis will say, yeah, there's no going back to religion once you've kind of crossed the Rubicon of secularization, to mix metaphors horrifically. Okay, and the last one, right? And again, think of that kind of quote by Berger, that secularization isn't merely a Western phenomenon, right? So it's not just something that, say, we believe that secularization happened and it started in Europe, but might be kind of a European thing, right? That this kind of movement towards secularity might actually be something that only happens within that European context. He suggests that no, because this is these two implications, right? 1 and especially 3, that as these things sort of spread out across the world and different parts of the world enter modernity in their own ways, right? Maybe later, maybe more rapidly than other parts, they should all become secular, right? So they should all follow the path of Europe to some extent. Okay, so he's going to kind of work on these different points through the piece, and then in his longer kind of denunciation of secularization, which is a book called The Triumph of Faith, which kind of rehashes a lot of the arguments in longer form. Yeah, please. Yeah, of course.
So for the institutional differentiation, it's just basically that they're trying to like change the definition of it becoming more secular by saying, hey, well, no, it's split. So
yeah, essentially what he's accusing them of is saying like that they, instead of being like, what we meant by secularization was religion is going to go away. They're like, oh no, what we actually meant by secularization is religion is going to have less and less of a role in broader society, right? So it's not going to be running the churches, the schools. Sorry, it'll still be running the churches. It won't be running the schools, the hospitals, the social welfare system. And even though people might still believe in God, it might play less of a role in their lives, right? And he's suggesting that that's not what you meant when you were saying secularization. You're just trying to like rescue the term from the obvious failure of the broader theory.
oh, and what does that have to do with individual piety?
Well, so what he says is that they're now making the claim that all they meant was institutional differentiation, but he's saying no, what they actually always meant was that people would stop believing in God, right? So that their individual beliefs would fade away, right? So that, does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, perfect. No problem. Whew. Okay, any other questions before I jump in to the next thing? I mean, it only took me like half hour to get through 3 slides. That's not bad. Okay. I think this is probably his most provocative claim in the piece, and it's a really interesting one. It's called The Myth of Past Piety. Oops, I went forward instead of backwards. So his most provocative claim in the piece, and the one upon which I think, whether you sort of believe his argument or not, sort of rests in large part on this one. But what Stark suggests is that, well, okay, let me back up one step. What's pretty clear is that the argument for the inherited model, late secularization, and all of that is very much dependent on Europe as the model for the rest of the world, right? I know I wrote a P and an E there. That Europe is the sort of model for everybody else and the development of secularization. So the claim is always made that Europe was very religious, especially in the Middle Ages, and that through modernization, Europe became less and less religious, and it's trending towards zero, right? Now, what Stark makes, the claim that Stark makes is that Europe was always much less religious than we have been led to believe, right? That this image we have of Europe as this incredibly, superstitious, and religious place in the Middle Ages is broadly a function of sort of a mythology in Western culture that comes to us from the Enlightenment, right? So think about it this way, if we think of sort of the way the past has been constructed in European history, you have, what were called for the longest time the Dark Ages, right? The period from the fall of Rome, of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, to basically the, more or less the Reformation, but the Renaissance sort of in the 16th. And that this period was a period of, where the church controlled everything. There was a huge amount of ignorance, right? There was no scientific thinking. The church specifically put out the light of learning in Europe, and this is why it gets called by the Enlightenment kind of marketers, the Dark Ages. And then, the Enlightenment comes, right? And all of these thinkers of the 18th century bring light back into Europe, right? The Renaissance, you get, the rediscovery of kind of Roman and Greek learning, and then the Enlightenment applies those things and brings Europe into an age of light and reason, right? It's predicated on this myth that the Middle Ages were this time, according to Stark anyway, it's predicated on what Stark thinks is a myth, that the Middle Ages were this time of super religiosity and ignorance, which has then been sort of, destroyed as people became less religious, as they became more rational. Now, the claim that Stark makes, and I know you've probably read this already because it took me a long time to get here, that religious participation was very low in Northern and Western Europe long before the onset of modernization. That actually low religiosity has been a sort of hallmark of European religion virtually since the 5th and 6th centuries, outside of a few very special cadres. Okay, so he also says that today, levels of subjective religiousness remain relatively high, right? So a general belief in God or a deity or something, that there's some greater meaning, that people have souls, whatever it happens to be, remains relatively high. And he suggests that often we classify nations as secularized even when a large majority of the inhabitants believe in God, and that this is a kind of very strange position. Okay, and a lot of this has to do with church attendance rates, right? That people, we measure religiosity in a lot of cases by church attendance, and Stark says, okay, that's one way to measure it, but certainly not the only one. Okay, how am I doing for time? Better than I thought. All right, so Stark has to sort of hang this argument again on breaking that European case, right? That if the whole secularization argument hangs on the idea that Europe was very religious, it encountered scientific rationality, it modernized, and then it became less religious, you got to sort of break Europe as the mold. So what he does is a sort of weird kind of sociology, because it's a sort of historical sociology, and we'll see it again when we look at his argument in the book, The Rise of Christianity. We don't have really good statistics for the Middle Ages, right? Because that's not how the world worked. Governments were not keeping statistics really until the 19th and in large part until the 20th centuries. So we don't have really great statistics in a lot of ways. So you kind of have to go back into historical documents and reconstruct religiosity kind of by anecdote and through things like church records, letters, and you're doing a much more, almost like an oral history in some ways of say, European religion. Okay, so to prove his claim that Europe was always a little bit irreligious, excuse me, Stark cites a litany of examples from medieval Christian scholars and religious figures basically complaining about the fact that nobody was going to church, nobody was deeply engaged in religion. The religion that people were engaged in was broadly kind of superstition rather than, Christianity in a proper sense. So, this is a quote from the piece. As for the ordinary people during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance, the masses rarely entered a church, and their private worship was directed towards an array of spirits and supernatural agencies, only some of them recognizably Christian. And this is, I think kind of inarguably true. What we know looking back at a lot of medieval kind of spirituality is a lot of like folk religions, pagan kind of gods got weirdly kind of stapled onto Christianity in funny ways. A lot of legends sort of, became Christianized in loose ways. And it just sort of allowed people to continue on doing what they were doing before Christianity sort of took over. So especially at the level of kind of, the peasants, the common people, the serfs, a lot of, kind of pagan folk religion sort of blended with Christianity in a fairly seamless way. And so you had a lot of, spirits, supernatural agencies, spirits and demons and, local gods that got kind of stapled into Christianity in some ways. And this is, again, you could read, what's the book I'm thinking of? It's David Bentley Hart's. It's a mistitled book. The publisher really wanted this title and he did not. It's called Atheist Delusions, but it's not really about that. The atheist part is just a framing device at the beginning and end of the book. But Hart goes through kind of the Middle Ages and all of the superstitions that people had, their belief in magic, supernaturalism, which the church was always trying to dissuade people of. And my favorite story from that particular book is, and I can't remember which medieval saint it is, but basically was confronted with a woman who professed herself to be a witch and believed that she could pass through keyholes in doors. So to dissuade her of this notion, he locked the door, put the key in his pocket, and proceeded to chase her around the room with a broom, telling her, well, if you're a witch who can pass through keyholes, then do it. And, you can imagine how this ended. She could not pass through keyholes and was dissuaded of her own magical powers. But the church was always confronting these kind of superstitions, beliefs in magics, and all of these sort of things that pervaded through the Middle Ages. The suggestion here is that the triumph of Christianity was never particularly thorough in medieval Europe. Okay, other suggestions, which again, this is inarguably true. Many priests could not properly perform Mass because they neither spoke nor understood Latin, right? And the Mass, until the 1960s, was performed entirely in Latin. Now, this is obvious. One of the things that happens through the Middle Ages is nobles in particular, if they have more than one son, well, one son inherits the estate, right, from their father. The second, third, fourth sons need to be given something to do. And so a lot of times their parents would buy them a priestly office, right? So they would actually pay the church to have that person appointed as a priest, right? And so that person would, be appointed as a priest, start collecting a salary. Whether they showed up or not, or ever did the training, was something that actually was less consistent. And if we look at, parish records and bishops going about, checking out the churches under their leadership, a lot of medieval churches, had no pastor or absentee pastors, right? The noble who had been appointed the pastor and was collecting his wages would, how should I put it generously, go about whoring and other things and get on with his life while collecting his church salary, but never actually show up to run the church that he was appointed. Extensive surveys of kind of surviving parish churches in lots of parts of Europe reveal that they were way too small to hold more than a fraction of the local inhabitants. There are records of bishops showing up to their parishes under their care and finding that they were being used in the winter to house animals, right? That they were basically being used as a barn by the locals because, again, the priest was not present. And when people showed up, you have lots of complaints from, priests writing back, the ones that were there writing back, being like, when people even bother to show up, They don't listen to what I'm saying. They act inappropriately. They bring their dogs in. They fart. They burp. They sleep in the church. And basically, the Middle Ages is kind of a mess. We tend to think of it as this very pious time, and there certainly was some of that, though according to Stark, it was more amongst the nobility and upper classes than broadly kind of distributed. All right, I got 9 minutes. Okay. So, according to Stark, we have somewhat better data for the Renaissance. But what it shows is still pretty dismal from a religious point of view. So, according to this kind of study done by Lassett in 1965, right, looking at kind of historical church records, only about 125 of 400 adults in a particular English village took Easter communion in the late 18th century. And he went on to note that they had much smaller attendance in other villages. Now, why is this important? In kind of basic kind of Anglo-Catholic doctrine, Easter is the one time that you have to go to church and take communion, right? You're supposed to do it at least once a year at the very minimum. The more the better, but at the very minimum, you're supposed to do it once a year at Easter, right? It's called, it's referred to often as your Easter duty, historically. That, your basic kind of minimal Christian duty was to take communion at Easter. And most people didn't even bother to do that. So, what Stark suggests too is if we look at how many people belong to actual parish churches, actual particular communities, he suggests that in England, church membership was higher in 2000 than it was in 1800, right? And again, like I said, in 1800, right, this is really prior to the first Great Revival in England, right? So that would have been a very low ebb of religion in kind of English society, after which you have these 3 to 5 waves of revival that kind of push people back into religion. But in 1800, we have pretty good evidence that actual church membership was pretty low. And it was only through the work of the Methodists and the Baptists and others that people were pushed back into religion in major ways. Okay. So, key idea. Stark thinks that in the past, Europe was actually not particularly religious. And I know that probably, it might be a little bit hard to digest, but that's his argument. And, I think he makes a reasonable case for the idea that the nobility is probably pretty religious, right? The nobility, the upper classes, from whom, the great cathedrals of Europe are commissioned, for who fund much of the work of the church and universities, yes. But when it comes to the average person in medieval Europe, in a lot of ways, religion never really penetrated into their lives, right? And I mean, one of the things that Stark will talk about is the fact that when you have, places like Sweden. So Sweden, Finland, Norway were Christianized relatively late, right? They're the last places to be Christianized in Europe, in essence, because they're the furthest away. What happens after the Reformation, right, is a bunch of nobles want to split off from the Catholic Church because they're sick of listening to the Pope, right? The Reformation starts 1517, and you get the Protestant Reformation. And places, so Finland, Sweden, and Norway, all switch from Catholic to Protestant. And basically, in some other places that had been somewhat more deeply Christianized, like Italy, parts of France, there's kind of religious conflict that happens. In places like Sweden, you never have any religious conflict, right? It's like, now we're Lutheran, and people are like, we're what now? What were we before? Oh, who cares, right? They switch from Catholic to Lutheran pretty seamlessly because they were never, like the average person was never really deeply religious to begin with. Okay, so here's the anti-secularization claim. The perception that something has dramatically changed and that so that we were super religious in the past and we're now not particularly religious, he says this is the result of historical ignorance. And he quotes this piece from Andrew Greeley, a friend of his and another major sociologist of religion of the 20th century, that there could be no de-Christianization of Europe because there was never any Christianization in the first place, that Christian Europe never really existed beyond a sort of veneer on the surface. Okay.
Maybe you could say that if Christian Europe never truly existed, then why was it that the colonized countries of Europe became the Christian movement?
So it's an interesting question. I think the sort of basic explanation is that who is sort of going out and colonizing is typically, it's kind of elite led, and it sort of brings along religion. And especially, you get Catholic priests and some Protestants coming along kind of behind. The US is a weird case. The US has its own kind of particular history that really sort of hits after 1776, and we'll talk about it. But, you kind of have in tow this kind of elite class of the clergy that's attached to the elite class that's doing a lot of the colonizing. And if you look at examples like Latin America, we have a pretty good sense that the Christianization of Latin America was quite superficial, right? That it was like, if you take a place like Brazil, it's sort of the elite kind of European Brazilians that are particularly, say, Catholic, but it never really trickles down much below into the common people who are kind of, shall we say, lightly Christianized until much later, and really until you get the arrival of Protestant missionaries in the 20th century. And until then, it's like a very, very superficial, very light Christianization. So the elites kind of bring their religion along, and they're like, now you're all Christian, but the depths of it are not particularly huge. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. I have 2 minutes. I don't think I have time for Christianization failed. Let's break 2 minutes early, and we'll come back on Monday. All right, let's have a great weekend. We'll see you on Monday, and I'll try to get your exams marked by then, if all goes well, which it won't.